Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
They would say, like, look, we'd be happy to have Venezuelan immigrants living in Martha's Vineyard if they could come up with $2.25 million to buy a place. We would love to have them around. They would enrich the place. They just don't seem to want to do it. Or they would say, oh, of course, we would love to have affordable housing here. I mean, it's just it's really going to have to go through a whole environmental review because the terns are migrating. I mean, the other thing about this that just cracked me up, when Trump came in, there was this, all of a sudden, there was this like upswell of people like talking about Hitler, talking about the Holocaust, crying about refugees, screaming about genocide, like nonstop. And I kind of got the same taste from a lot of this stuff, like the Martha's Vineyard people. And I get the feeling they're sort of they took a break for a couple of years, but now they're going to start gearing it up again.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and publisher and president Ryan Williams. Lots going on. I feel like I say that every week now, but it really is true, and things I think are heating up a little bit now that the fall is essentially upon us. I never quite remember whether there's like an official day that fall actually starts, and I never remember whether we've passed it or not. But spiritually, emotionally, I am in fall. I am wearing my boots and cozying up to like falling leaves or something. I don't know. What do you do in fall? Basic white girl stuff, I guess. Anyway, this is not a fall podcast about fall. It's a podcast about Texas House Bill 20. Which is the law in Texas which makes it illegal to engage in viewpoint discrimination if you are a social media company with more than 50 million active users. So that's a pretty high bar. These are the real big tech heavy hitters, places like Twitter, Google, YouTube, and so forth. And effectively, the situation is twofold. The first thing is what I already mentioned. You can't ban people based on political viewpoints. That is now illegal in Texas. And then I had to pat myself on the back a little bit because they took my advice. I'm sure that Governor Greg Abbott and Texas legislators are close listeners to the Roundtable and were hearing me bang the drum about subpoena the algorithm, make the algorithm public. This will help us to investigate what's really going on, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be a matter of public interest. They didn't, of course, quite do that. You can't quite subpoena the algorithm for both technical and legal reasons, I would suspect, but they are demanding a report of some of these practices in terms of, speech suppression, speech magnification, what exactly is going on under the hood, as it were, of these programs that we now all use that have become the kind of digital public square. In any case, this became law on the 9th of September. It was subsequently blocked by a district judge, Robert Pittman, in December. Sorry, I should say 9th of September 2021 here. This is a sort of extended timeline because just recently we've had the law has won again. The injunction was first lifted on the 11th of May in 2022. And now we've had another Fifth Circuit reversal of the injunction on the 16th of September. That brings us up to speed. So the Circuit Court has upheld this law. It will continue to be in effect. And my suspicion is that it'll go to the Supreme Court. So this is going to be, I think, one of our major items to watch in the ongoing discussion about just what to do with the fact that much of our discussion now takes place online. These companies, which are often defended as private entities and private companies, therefore free to engage in all sorts of censorship. They have become, as we've discussed at length on this podcast, they've become much more than private companies. They've become the kind of de facto hosts of American public discussion. They've become powerful enough to silence the sitting president of the United States. They've played a major role in elections. And of course, they are also backed by enormous government subsidies, tax breaks, and so forth. Always have been. Their development itself was influenced by the government. They are often, as we've learned from Jen Psaki, among others, they are often in conversation with government entities, and not to say active and open collusion. We just a couple of weeks ago discussed the FBI, the close-knit relationship between Mark Zuckerberg and the FBI. So in any case, we know that these are not, in fact, plucky garage startups, if they ever were. This particular approach to the situation seems to me to be based on treating these companies like common carriers. You know, an example of a common carrier is like a phone company, these utility style services that we all need to be able to use. And that's, part of that is capping it at 50 million users, or rather putting a floor at 50 million users. So that's the approach that this bill sort of reflects. And we will see what the Supreme Court makes of it, I guess. But what do you guys think? I mean, this is, first of all, what do you make of this as an approach to the big tech free speech issue? Is this the right way to go about rectifying some of the problems we've got in this domain?
Yeah, maybe, probably. It's, I think setting the high threshold is a good one. This is one of the themes of our Constitution Day, which we had just this last weekend. Josh Hammer took up this question a bit, former Claremont fellow and opinion editor at Newsweek. Many of our listeners who are on Twitter a lot, I'm sure, know who Josh is. But this case, Net Choice v. Paxton, we briefed, that is, the Claremont Institute briefed it, our Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence. So this seems to me to be one of the more fruitful ways of proceeding, which is to treat the very large social media companies online as a kind of species of common carrier or stewards of the public square in a way, or our new digital public square. So I will be very interested to see what the Supreme Court makes of this. The panel of judges included our good old friend of Claremont Institute, Edith Jones, and one of the greatest judges of the recent decades. She was appointed as a very young, I think she was maybe 38 or so, appointed in the first Reagan administration, I think. I think that's right. So Judge Jones has been serving for a long time. She's a former recipient of our Reagan Jurisprudence Award, which we give out every year at Constitution Day, and which we gave out this year to Judge Jim Ho, also of the Fifth Circuit, although he wasn't on this panel. So that's just some interesting background. We're very much in this fight and not disinterested commentators, but I'm more or less in favor of relentless, ceaseless experimentation, to riff on an old FDR quote on the matter of big tech. I think we are just beginning on the broader right to appreciate the problem of big tech, especially when it, as it seems, mounting evidence for it doing this more and more, puts its thumb on the scale of public deliberation and the conduct of the public deliberation on controversial issues like COVID, and especially around elections. So we need to not be timid in exhausting all legal, jurisprudential, and constitutional means to try and chasten a bit the tech overlords. So seems like a good development.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I was surprised when I saw it. I mean, I guess it could go to because it was just 3 judges, right?
Yeah.
And they split. So I guess it could go to an en banc hearing, like where the whole, all the judges decide before it goes to the Supreme Court. It does. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine this Supreme Court, which, obviously it's a divided court, but it's also divided. Even the right wing of it seems divided between kind of a Claremonty new right and then sort of a old-fashioned, I guess, just neoliberal right that would, seek to preserve private interests. I can't imagine the Supreme Court actually upholding the law on this, the Texas statute. But maybe they would. I don't know. But it's salutary. I mean, I'm glad to see that somebody's got the stones to push back against big tech on this, because it's just become, it's making the country intolerable to think that this essentially a cabal, this like network of oligarchs get to decide what people see and hear. And, Tam will be publishing that Josh Hammer talk.
Oh, excellent.
I'm editing it now. So, listeners, keep your eyes open.
Yeah, Clarence Thomas has given some indication that he is sympathetic to or even supports the common carrier attitude. This was Knight Institute v. Trump, which did not go Trump's way, but did contain in Thomas's opinion this kind of indicator that a common carrier is the right way to understand what these companies are, the right way to view their status in law, and the right way to kind of deal with, as both of you guys have said, the new, just sort of massive structural problem that we have. This seems to me, I have this kind of, I'm not sure if this is unethical or immoral or whatever, unprincipled, maybe you could call it unprincipled. I don't really care how you go about doing this, so long as you take some sort of action on it. And I know that obviously some procedures are likely to be more effective than others. But my feeling about the right to free speech is that it's not it's prior to government. Like, it comes from God and is defended by government. But there's no, just because a company makes a bunch of money or has a bunch of success, like, that doesn't imply to me that there's any, like, they don't get to then be like, oh yeah, and actually if you try to create an alternative platform, we're going to axe you from the servers, which like happened with Parler. That just seems like a manifest abridgment of what is a right of, all men, and what is a, guaranteed right of Americans by our form of government. So my understanding of these companies, for what it's worth, is that they are effectively parastate entities. I think they've given us ample demonstration of that. If they hadn't come out and basically said it in a number of ways and in a number of times, then the very structure of their creation would kind of make that clear. But in fact, they have said, both the government and the companies have at multiple points indicated that they're kind of tightly knit together. They're doing the government's business dirty work, as Philip Hamburger has often pointed out, and you just can't do that. That there's so yeah. Call them common carriers, sure. To me, the bigger issue is that they are kind of state adjacent or state derivative or whatever you want to call them, and in some cases they seem like way more savvy and competent and powerful than the state, or at least the people that run these companies seem way more savvy and competent and powerful than the people that are charged with making our laws. So yeah, I'm delighted to see this. I agree with Seth. Like, this is one, I don't know, we just had this raft of incredible Supreme Court decisions from these conservative justices, so I may be surprised, but we've also in the past had disappointments from people like Gorsuch on the, I think it's called the Bostock case on transgenderism and stuff like that. So they could definitely, it might be really difficult for them to get enough votes, I think, to uphold this thing. But as Ryan says, like, we got to start somewhere, and this seems like a pretty sound approach to it, especially the part where they have to like come clean about what they're doing. Like that in and of itself seems to me kind of indisputable. Like, I understand people saying, well, once you start telling companies, if you really did think of these as private companies, and you say, well, once you start telling private companies, you compel speech, where's that going to end? Like, I get that concern, even though I think it's misguided in this instance. But I don't see why you wouldn't just like demand that these enormous companies that obviously have a serious role to play in the public square, and why you wouldn't demand that they offer up information that's very much in the public's interest to know. Am I crazy? Like, why haven't we done this everywhere already? Why have we been so slow on it?
I think it's because there's a lot of the right that just feels really itchy about telling companies what to do,
Right.
about that our side would get involved in the decisions of private companies that are trying to maximize their shareholder value. I mean, look, I agree with you completely. And I think we need to at least, wake those people up to the fact that, as you said, these are essentially like quasi-state entities that are behaving without any, I mean, it's kind of like if you had a squad of, if the government sent a squad of mercenaries into Ukraine, but maintained like plausible deniability about it. Like, well, they're not ours. They're working for a private company.
Hmm.
I mean, it's almost like that. It's that type of thing. One thing I like that the judge, the majority ruling said that these companies behave as though there's an unenumerated right to stifle speech that, in a sense, is more fundamental than the enumerated right to protect speech, to free speech. That, yes, it's true that you have the right to say what you want, but we certainly have a more foundational right to deny you a platform. And that's kind of the argument you always hear, like, well, go start your own Twitter if you don't like it. And as you pointed out, like, there's network effects, and they have the power to crush any alternate Twitter, like Parler or whatever, on the grounds that, oh, well, they haven't promised to to quash all hate speech. In other words, they haven't promised to be exactly like us. Since they haven't promised to take on our terms of service and our mode of censorship, comments we don't like, well, we won't allow them to exist. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's really bad, and obviously something needs to happen.
Yeah, no, this conservative allergy to anything that threatens like business and enterprise. Obviously, people who listen to this podcast probably don't need us to rehearse the argument that it comes from this kind of Reaganite three-legged stool and was designed. That emphasis was part of a very specific prudential response to a very specific set of challenges. The rise of communism and the birth and growth of the administrative state and like rule by regulation, rule by regulatory agency, and all of those things remain concerns. None of them is gone. In fact, many of them have mutated and taken on new form. But like one of the central ideas of prudence is that when things change in form, different kinds of approach and different emphases are appropriate. And I just think that, even if I did believe that these were private companies, which I really don't think that's an accurate way to describe them, but if they were, you don't have, as you say, Seth, or as the judge said, I guess, you don't have a right to gain so much power that you can cancel out other people's rights. Like, that's just not a thing. And again, those rights are not contingent upon adequate government conditions or contingent upon you're having a certain amount of money. They are, in fact, absolute, and that's structurally what it says in our text. Like, that's not that's kind of like if you don't like that, then you want to be living in a different country. And I do sort of, I feel like this reflexive concern about enterprise and business has become more of a bumper sticker than a carefully thought out position. Let's talk about another conservative. Some are calling it a stunt. Some others are calling it a important action in the border crisis. So obviously this just massive influx of illegal immigrants has been going on. Well, it's been going on for many, many years, but it's reached crisis levels under Biden, who has rolled back a lot of the stuff that Trump had put in place to try and alleviate this problem. You've got mass deaths, both of migrants and of the people in cities that are being border cities that are being overrun. You've got like severe infrastructural problems, and so a number of conservative politicians have taken to sending some number of migrants, some busload or group of migrants to these places where liberals like to virtue signal and to declare themselves sanctuary cities, right? So you have Abbott was doing this for a while. And the idea is, well, okay, if you believe that what we ought to do is just open our borders and take in as many people as want to come here, then you ought to be bearing this cost and not the mostly red states that are, suffering directly from this just impossible situation. And so this has become kind of a means of, to call it political theater is to disparage it, but it's a means of kind of performance art or something that you show the people who are making these sort of virtuous noises what the consequences of their rhetoric actually are. And the latest in this sort of series is Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, whose speech at NatCon we just reprinted over at the American Mind, flew out 50 immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, which the choice of location is, to me, classic DeSantis. It's very DeSantisian or DeSantesian in that it's got that kind of whiff of the culture war about it as well, that these wealthy elite liberals are out here sipping their martinis or their Arnold Palmers and golfing and sitting on the beach, and they're mouthing off about how great and warm and receptive they would be if they had to take in all these migrants. And now, of course, here there are 50 migrants at their doorstep. And there was some, also quite theatrical, I think. There were some acts of reception. There were people like coming out to greet these migrants and giving them food and doing all this stuff. But there was also the National Guard who immediately removed them from Martha's Vineyard. So this has been, I think, an object of rightly a lot of kind of mockery on Twitter, a lot of jokes about it, which may in fact be part of the point. And I guess they're now going, where is it, to Cape Cod? That seems to be their next destination. There also now is a lawsuit. Some of the migrants are suing Governor Ron DeSantis, filed in Boston, because ostensibly they claim he didn't tell them where they were going, or he told them, false or misleading information about what they would get, what sort of resources would be available to them when they arrived in Martha's Vineyard. So that's ongoing and will continue to be. There are a number of different ways that you can look at this issue, one of which is, is this kind of using immigrants in as props in political theater, which to me is sort of it's sort of a limp accusation, given that these people are in fact already, victims in some sense of the overly permissive attitudes of the Democrats, and they are here. So they might as well go to the place where they're being told they're going to be welcomed and accepted. So that at least the people who are creating this disaster situation get to see what they have wrought. But then there's the political question. Is this going to be a win for DeSantis or Democrats or both or neither? What do you guys think? Is this going to be an effective way of getting some sort of response out of the Biden administration or out of Congress on the border crisis?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Seth.
Well, I was just going to say that, it's already a success. It's already like a slam dunk, because no matter like whatever else, it's now being talked about. And for the last year and a half, we've had 250,000 people coming across the border every month, and the media refused to look at it. It was just an outright, blackout on this question. No one would talk about it except Fox or whatever, and some of the right wing. The fact that it has now penetrated the mainstream media, that alone is a huge win. Even liberal outlets like The Onion were forced to make fun of the Martha's Vineyard people doing all their virtue signaling. it made them look ridiculous. But here's the interesting thing. I think I alluded to this on the podcast a few weeks ago when I said, look, maybe they're going to arrest Greg Abbott. Sure enough, there are now, from multiple fronts, efforts to destroy Ron DeSantis. And you know what? I realized something, that the number one political crime in America is to embarrass Democrats. And if you embarrass Democrats, they will spend the rest of your life harassing you legally. I think that, like Donald Trump, the fact that he won, I don't think it wouldn't matter what he did after that. The fact that he won and he embarrassed Hillary Clinton, that was his crime. After that, it didn't, the specifics of any of his, policies or his rhetoric, I think was kind of secondary. And we're seeing the same type of thing now. They're going after him because it was effective. So now they're going to tie him up. They're going to have lawsuits against him. The sheriff of San Antonio is saying that it was kidnapping. It was human trafficking. I mean, they're obviously also lining up all of their talking points for the election. But I mean, what the hell? Like 50 people showed up in Martha's Vineyard and it became like a crisis that required the National Guard to come out. I mean, you've got 5,000 people coming across every day to these like impoverished little towns on the Tex-Mex border. Look, it was brilliant. Ron DeSantis is obviously like a street fighter, and he's very smooth and very smart, and like the way he parried, things like what Hakeem Jeffries had to say about human trafficking and kidnapping. I mean, he's like, well, nobody seemed to get mad when 50 people were found dead in a trailer in San Antonio. Like that didn't like outrage everybody. But just one more thing. I'm sorry to keep going. I've just been like obsessed with this all week. I'm seeing it in New York, right? Because Abbott is sending some buses up here. Not even that many. I mean, there's been a few thousand, but the indignation and the self-righteousness about how glorious the liberals here are with their welcoming response. And they keep saying, like, we're putting Texas to shame because they thought that we weren't going to be nice to these people, but we are. Look how nice we are. But it's like, well, nobody ever said you weren't going to be nice to them. It's just like, hey, share the wealth. Like, diversity is our greatest strength. Immigrants, or a nation of immigrants. New York City's always been like the sanctuary city, according to these folks. Well, okay, go for it. What's the problem? I mean, Eric Adams just keeps saying, look, I love having them here. It's just a matter of coordination. And Greg Abbott isn't coordinated. It's like, well, what's to coordinate? They're here. You've got the systems. You just, New York City has a right to shelter. So figure something out. Look, it's like somebody on Twitter, Adam Elwanger, who writes for us, said like a stunt is anything that shows up Democrat hypocrisy. So again, that's what they call it. But they're only mad because it's working.
Yeah, I agree. I think there should be more of this from every red state governor in a position to do it. Look, the kind of, it's now an anachronistic term from the way back in the 90s or even earlier, but the limousine liberals across blue cities and their blue suburbs should be made to live by their own principles. And, they've gotten to freeload and sit back and virtue signal about this sort of thing. And showing them up publicly, repeatedly, I think is good politics. Of course, it's political theater, but politics is political theater. Theater is part of politics, so that's all fine. And especially, some of the criticism of DeSantis is that he's playing politics with people's lives. It's disgusting. Last I checked, he's flying chartering planes, private planes, or chartered planes, and flying illegal immigrants from overwhelmed places like Texas to wealthy places like Martha's Vineyard. I want to see it in Marin. I'd like to see it in Carmel. more. I don't see why we shouldn't continue this, because as Seth said, I mean, the border states are disproportionately bearing this cost. I mean, there are, you go look at El Paso, and it's like it's a real humanitarian crisis. It's not 50 people showing up in Martha's Vineyard. It's thousands of people sleeping on the streets with no bathroom facilities because they're just completely overwhelmed because of this government's border policy, this administration's border policy. So it has the dual effect, or the dual beneficial effects of kind of causing rich liberals to freak out and to not quite know what to do, either in terms of optics or whatever. I mean, it was perfect that Martha's Vineyard said, "Oh, well, yeah, we're very caring. This is what the community coming together." And then, as Spencer mentioned, within 24 hours, they're bussed out to somewhere else because we just don't have the infrastructure to deal with this kind of thing, guys. That's kind of the excuse. It's like, well, go down to El Paso and check it out down there. They're completely overwhelmed. I hope we get more and more ways of doing this creatively and doing a lot more of it. It should be it should be an equal burden, especially for sanctuary states that are a long way from the border. So they should stop complaining and figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah, the infrastructure thing is so rich to me. It's like, oh, is it actually kind of difficult to incorporate like vast, unexpected numbers of people that you didn't plan on into your polity? Like, does that cause problems? I'm shocked to hear, like, nobody in Texas has ever thought that it might be logistically rather difficult to assimilate like vast numbers of new people every day. And right, this is like 50 people. It's a tiny fraction of what these towns are dealing with. And the other thing I like about it is that it makes clear, there, to me, there is of course also a philosophical issue with illegal immigration, namely that it it breaks the law, and a country should fundamentally having a country means that your laws make certain things illegal that then do not happen, or there are consequences. It's extremely demoralizing and delegitimizing to have a whole kind of universe of legal statute that just is nullified on the basis of a president's say so and the like ooey gooey feels of somebody in Martha's Vineyard or in upstate New York. This is like it's just obvious that in and of itself is kind of morally wrong and a failure of statesmanship. It causes all sorts of other knock-on effects having nothing to do with immigration, namely, for instance, that people, start to think of laws as kind of arbitrary tools wielded by the powerful and enforced when they choose, which is a message that we're also getting from a lot of like DAs and these sort of quote unquote reformers in positions of power over law enforcement. But at least, blue cities feel are the places that, that suffer under those policies are the places that elect the people that do that. Whereas in this case, you elect people, it's incredibly cheap. It's incredibly inexpensive virtue to elect people that will make national policy that then destroys the lives of people in, those deplorable states, those dirty ones where like it's just farms right out there and stuff. So it doesn't really matter. Getting the logistical disaster across, I think, is a really important and kind of especially amusing part of these actions, because it really, you can sit here and say like, 5,000 people crossing the border every day. And even I, in this conversation, am like, you could say 5,000, you could say 10,000, you could say 100,000. Like past a certain point, my brain actually isn't able to like grasp what that means logistically day by day, unless I hear, well, the farmers are spending like $10,000, regularly spending $10,000 to, fix the farms that have been damaged by people, just breaking in and so on and so forth. So like, I don't know. I just think that making these things concrete in this way is also really important. I wish that we could like find some equivalent way of conveying to people that already own 5 homes that like rampant spending and inflation, what it feels like to be trying to buy a house in the market that's created by Democrat policies. I wish we could do this, in all sorts of other departments as well. But this is a good start for sure.
Yeah, it also shows the emptiness of the sloganeering amongst the elite. Again, sort of limousine liberal left. I mean, Tucker this week had a field day with this, of course, and had an opening segment. I forget when it was, probably day of. I think it was, yeah, so it must have been day of. It was that first evening because it was before he had a chance to mock them for, of course, shipping them all off the island. But he said, I'm sorry, well, I'm confused. I thought diversity is our strength. Martha's Vineyard is very undiverse. It's now more diverse, and that should strengthen it. I'm sorry, I thought no person is illegal, and immigrants of all sorts, illegal or otherwise, are a blessing. I'm confused. Why isn't Martha's Vineyard just immediately enriched? And why shouldn't they have 5,000 more rather than 500? It shows the kind of mostly correct, of course, humorous, slightly hyperbolic, but pretty revealing quote from an old writer for National Review before he was canceled for being a jerk, among other things, Joe Sobran. But he had a great quote, which was, in their migratory and mating habits, rich liberals are virtually indistinguishable from the KKK. They preach diversity and tolerance, and yet they live in and vacation in kind of lily white snapshots from a bygone era in America that on paper they would call racist, patriarchal, sexist, and all the rest. So it's we need to find more creative ways of making the left live under its own principles and causing them to freak out when they're made to do so.
Well, they often, I think, just don't think of these sorts of policies as laws under which they live, right? I mean, the regime enforcement is for other people. That's the whole point.
Well, I think they would say, like, look, we'd be happy to have Venezuelan immigrants living in Martha's Vineyard if they could come up with $2.25 million to buy a place. We would love to have them around. They would enrich the place. They just don't seem to want to do it. Or they would say, oh, of course, we'd love to have affordable housing here. I mean, it's just it's really going to have to go through a whole environmental review because the terns are migrating. I mean, the other thing about this that just cracked me up, when Trump came in, all of a sudden there was this like upswell of people like talking about Hitler, talking about the Holocaust, crying about refugees, screaming about genocide, like nonstop. And I kind of got the same taste from a lot of this stuff, like the Martha's Vineyard people. And I get the feeling they're sort of they took a break for a couple of years, but now they're going to start gearing it up again. Like when Trump did the Muslim ban and thousands of people ran out to the airport and they were all like waving signs, "You are welcome here. We love you. No down," and all this stuff. And I mean, that's clearly what they're angling to do again. Like, this is all about hatred of the other and, all of that. Meanwhile, of course, they're the ones who hate the other because they don't want them here. It's a weird war that seems to be mostly going on. It's like an intra-white war. It's like a civil war between the whites, like the good thinking ones of Martha's Vineyard and the mean-spirited ones, like of whom Ron DeSantis is the Lord. Like, I don't really hear too many other people getting that worked up about this stuff. I mean, even like Latinos don't really seem to be as exercised.
No, Latinos want, I think, when you poll them, by and large, they want a path to citizenship plus enforcement of the laws on the books at the border. So it's like it's a little bit of both, but it's certainly, like, as usual, people that come here legally or are here legally after having taken some sort of path to citizenship, like they don't want to live in a country that is porous, that's borderless. Like, this whole thing, like, no person is illegal. It's like, okay, well, but like actions are illegal, right? Like, that's what laws are. And to me, I just come back to this thing where it's like that you either have laws which apply in all cases, or you have just the military force of the state wielded by people, by whoever can make the sort of most fashionable virtue claim. And this is like one of the most ancient, you don't have to be like a political theorist, genius of political philosophy to recognize this. It's one of the like primary maxims of like political theory 101. You can go read like the Constitution of Athens, and they're talking about this. Either you have a government of laws or you have a government of men. And like this idea that somehow you're mean because you want the thing that is illegal to be punished by the law is just like a really deeply corrosive and insane thing with obvious consequences and painful consequences that are now, I think, rightly being felt. All right. Well,
Spencer, just one last thought.
Yeah.
And it comes to me just because my father is in Arizona right now and is reporting to me on the local ads being run against Blake Masters and Carrie Lake. And so one more benefit, I think, of making this a national issue is to make sort of nationalizing this question of the border crisis in the way that, in a sort of big public way, that busing and plane rides and all the rest from Abbott and DeSantis. This is good because it will force candidates who are trying to run completely disingenuously in the National Democratic Party. The report on the ground from Arizona from my father is that the ads against Lake and the ads against Masters and Lake by Mark Kelly and I forget who's running against in the gubernatorial race against Lake are basically that the Democrats are the party that back police, that are pro-police, that want to get tough on crime. They're riffing on Biden's theme from the red sermon, as it's being called, that somehow because Republicans were against the raid on Mar-a-Lago, were against law enforcement. And that also is the party of a secure border. So they're sort of running as Republicans and on those two issues, which is revealing and reflects I think the independent vote or independent voters' opinion in Arizona. So this is just one more way in which you can proliferate opportunities to pull that mask off by making this question one that is unavoidable by the press and something they want to ask Democratic candidates about across the country.
Yeah. And hey, if they want to run by pretending to be Republicans, I would say you go right ahead, pretend all the way to the legislature and keep pretending when you write the laws and when you vote on things, and then you'll just be a Republican. And imagine that, like, then the things that you do will be popular and people will vote for you to do them, and we'll have a country that functions. Well, in any case, in this House, we believe that the National Guard should be swiftly flown out to deal with any and all illegal immigration. We obviously will continue to see this sort of chicanery on the part of the left trying to portray this as a humanitarian, as a sin against God and man. And hopefully we will also see more successful attempts to wrong foot the Democrats on this issue, which by all rights should be an absolutely abysmal one for them in the polls, and they should suffer severe electoral consequences for it. Okay, well, President Joe Biden went on 60 Minutes. And as everybody knows, when Biden gives interviews or speeches and when he makes public statements, it is always a seamless and smooth procedure, smooth sailing from start to finish, and everything always goes off great, and he always comes out smelling like a rose. No, of course, I'm being sarcastic. This is not how Biden has ever dealt with the press. He's always been a bit of a liability when he makes public statements, and it's only gotten worse and worse as his age has gotten more advanced, and indeed as the situation in which he finds himself has become more and more of a quagmire of his own making. So Biden went on 60 Minutes, gave an interview with Scott Pelley, said a number of things that have been raising eyebrows. And what's fun about the things that Biden says is that not only do they make no sense, they kind of manage to confuse and offend like every possible constituency and side of the aisle. He says things that displease his own party. He says things that at the same time are objectionable from the right. And he manages to do it with a remarkable economy of language, it must be said. I mean, it takes him very, very few words to make an absolute mess of everything. Two instances that I'll highlight from this 60 Minutes interview. One, the the pandemic is over, which I have to say, when I saw that this was a news headline, I had to sort of recall like why that might be a noteworthy thing to say at all. I'm out here in Tennessee, and it's like the what? I don't even really remember. Oh, right, there was that thing where we all like wore masks, and it was very crazy for a while. No, I guess they were at this auto show, the Detroit Auto Show. And it's back in full swing. And Pelley says, so is the pandemic over? And Biden says, yeah, we still have a problem, but the pandemic is over. And for saying this, what is obviously the baseline kind of attitude, the instinct and presumption of the vast majority of Americans at this point, anybody that is not just in kind of in the deep COVID fantasia, still addicted to or married to the state of emergency, the pandemic is so over. It's way over. They're like they keep saying, oh, we're still having so many deaths a day, but last I checked, the deaths are not even close to flu status at this point. It's obviously become a seasonal thing. If you so choose, you can bury yourself under boosters. You can be like Scrooge McDuck and dive into a giant pool of booster shots if you want. There's no shortage of any of that. And so, yeah, the pandemic is over. This, of course, enraged. I mean, Fauci went on the news to say, no, the pandemic is not over. All of these, kind of COVID hawks said, don't pay no attention to the man on 60 Minutes. And of course, at the same time that he's saying this, the Biden administration is pursuing all sorts of emergency measures on the basis of the pandemic, right? I mean, this was student debt has been justified by pandemic emergency. They're in court right now arguing that the CDC should be able to mandate masks again on planes. So, the pandemic's over, if you want it. The war is over if you want it. And when Biden, needs to say this, he'll say it. But of course, he's also still acting as if like the pandemic justifies any number of extraordinary behaviors. All of these things, he'd have to give up a lot of stuff that he kind of like helped himself to if indeed the pandemic were really over. And he certainly doesn't want to do that. So that's one kind of amusing little Biden gaffe. The other one was, to me, somewhat more serious, and that's about Taiwan. Now, this has become a little ritual we have. It's one of our national traditions is that Biden goes in public and he's asked if the U.S. would put boots on the ground to defend Taiwan, or if we would defend Taiwan in some other way should China invade. He says, yes, absolutely. The White House then immediately kind of rushes in to reassure us all that the president did not mean what he said. And in fact, we have a policy of strategic ambiguity. We're not saying what we would do in the case of a Taiwan invasion. So this was also this was a ritual that we repeated this time around. I think it's happened like 4 times or something. And that too was, on the one hand, a more regular thing. Biden does this all the time. But on the other hand, an increasingly serious thing to be talking about, especially in light of Ukraine, in light of, a China that's making louder and louder noises about Taiwan, that's becoming stronger and stronger. David Goldman argued at NatCon and in the American Mind that this is something China will absolutely go to war over. It has to do with its territorial integrity and is not limited to the communist regime, but actually is rooted in much deeper impulses to preserve the Chinese empire and against sort of foreign interference and crack up. So anyway, this is simply to say, I guess my question for you guys is, do these disastrous public statements represent any actual tension between Biden and the White House, or Biden and his base, or do they simply represent, is there no rhyme or reason to them whatsoever because Biden is now so dissociative that what comes out of his mouth on any given day is anybody's guess, including his?
Well, it's a very Biden thing in the sense that I really don't think it has too much to do with his age. Like, it just makes this worse. But he's always been like this. I mean, he has always been a quote unquote gaffe machine, going back to the 80s. This has always been Biden. So that's nothing new. My tweet about it, and then I had a follow up because I didn't actually watch the whole interview, but I saw I think it was maybe Taiwan first and then the pandemic second. It's really, it's also reflects the modern presidency. somebody should go, if you're interested, our visiting Washington fellow, Theo Wold, wrote, it's basically, he gave a speech at one of our conferences we had in DC, the Lies, the Ruling Class conference. And Theo's point was, the piece is called Lame Duck Nation. So if you go to American Mind, Theo Wold, Lame Duck Nation, it'll pop right up. But his point was, and it was sort of exacerbated under Trump, an administration in which Theo worked. But I think it's the case for all presidents now, less so for Democratic presidents because of the political proclivities, overwhelming political proclivities of bureaucrats and administration types. But the president is this kind of free-floating rhetorical figure. Real policy is made by the experts and the admin types. And so I think this divide between the putative commander-in-chief on matters of foreign policy and the head of, say, domestic law enforcement, or whatever, as the president is by the constitutional standards, that is, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's how how we've always understood the president to be sort of chief law enforcement officer in the country, in a way, at least over matters of federal control. This gap will continue to widen. So I think it reflects both the way we've done government over the past century, that is to say, a turn towards expert rule rather than political rule, and then also Biden just being Biden, made a little worse because he's a little more undisciplined now because he's older and his cognitive faculties are declining. So it is amusing. It's, I guess, more amusing with the pandemic business than Taiwan, considering, he's sort of committing the fatal flaw of diplomacy and foreign policy seriousness, as our late colleague Codevilla would say, which is, speaking a lot and not doing much, or coupling the unbridled tongue with the unready hand, to quote Theodore Roosevelt, a quote that Angela liked a lot. So it's much more frightening in the realm of foreign policy. I agree with you, Spencer. And then, but I mean, in a way, on the pandemic stuff, whatever we think of Biden on other topics, I mean, he's right, of course. Of course, the pandemic's over. You talked about boosters. The latest is part of the hand-wringing that grew out of that gaffe by Biden on the pandemic, which you can pick up this kind of stuff by reading the Politico morning recap, a couple days later. And, they're very concerned, and administration people are very concerned, and public health people are very concerned because they're trying to get everyone to take these bivalent boosters, which is they're kind of a hybrid of hybrid boosters from both Moderna and Pfizer, which have a bit of material from that tracks the Omicron strain, and a bit of material that tracks the who knows, the B4, B5, whatever, maybe not even Omicron at this point. It doesn't really matter. These boosters are always tracking like the last variant, which has already burned through the population. So it's all very stupid, but it's a problem now because it'll be that much harder to get people to take this bivalent booster because they see their president saying the pandemic's over, hence the scrambling by Fauci and all the rest. So the whole thing is, I don't know. If I were Biden, I think he's with it enough to know that it's probably at this point a liability and a mistake to do a 60-minute sit-down interview. Even half scripted, it's just a danger. And you'd think that his communications operation and the people around him would really discourage this kind of thing, because it's just, it's rinse and repeat with this guy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. There you
go. Oh, well, I was just going to say, to me, it seems like the figure that Biden seems most like to me at this point is Marshal Pétain of like Vichy France. Just this kind of this weird figurehead speaking about things as though it were 30 or 40 years in the past. This kind of sentimentalized hero in his own mind who nobody really pays attention to. This kind of senilo fascism. The soft senilo fascism. I mean, the thing that really struck me about that interview is his bonkers comment about inflation, which was so tone deaf. The guy is like, well, what do you people are really struggling. They can't buy groceries and inflation is soaring and the stock market plummeted. Biden's like, well, hold on a second. stop pretending like it's really bad. It just went up an inch. Now, here's the thing. Biden is looking at it from the perspective of some kind of, policy communications wonk who thinks, well, what's the inflection point?
Yeah.
Inflation's it's not getting worse. But just because inflation is the same, that doesn't make it easier. That just means your prices are still going up by 8 or 10%. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, things have leveled out. It just means that it's not going up as fast. It's like the rate of acceleration is even now. So he's so past it. And so, it's unbelievable to me that this guy's, and, I think a funny measure of it is Tim Allen. He's not my favorite comedian, but whatever. He made this joke like, oh, I heard Biden was on 60 Minutes. He asked how long the show is. And people went people just got so, you could see their teeth grit. They just got so angry that anybody would dare to make fun of Biden in this way. They acted like it was the most vicious, offensive comment. I don't know. Look, their internal polling must be terrible if they thought we need to trot him out to set things straight.
I know. Do you think this was is it possible to imagine that this was actually their damage control from that speech a while back? Like, Ryan, when you were saying I didn't watch this whole thing all the way through, I was thinking, well, you've already taken the bullet for all of us by watching the
Red
Biden semi-fascist Emperor Palpatine.
And that thing was only 20 minutes. Yeah,
exactly. 60 minutes. That's the other thing. It's even on a good day, with when you're relatively compos mentis and you feel generally confident in your media presence, 60 minutes is it is very likely that you're going to say at least one thing that you will regret in an hour-long interview, or wish that you could have said better. And this is Joe Biden, president houseplant. This is not, I don't know. It just seems like a terrible miscalculation. But I do sort of wonder if it was well, let's humanize him a little bit by putting him in front of an auto show,
Well, he remains, even though approval and all that stuff, I think they do lean on the fact that he remains kind of likable in a way. So that as opposed to the set piece, clenched fist, red backdrop thing of, sort of, yelling Joe, it's probably better to sit down with him and just have a conversation, and where he can, emote and empathize with folks for doing poorly. But yeah, you're right, Seth. The inflation thing was interesting because normally a Biden would be sort of empathetic in that, I know it's tough to buy groceries and blah, blah, blah. But no, he just fixated on, oh, come on now, it's not soaring. Inflation last month was 8.2%, and it's 8.3% this month. Quit blowing it out of proportion. Whereas the sort of the anecdotal experience of all of us, I think, and maybe it's not precisely correct quantitatively, but it's mostly trending correct. It's even my short grocery list now seems to cost $70 for some reason. And when I go for, a big one, it's 300 instead of, 210 or whatever. Everyone's sort of feeling this.
No, but you're right. Yeah. And it puts the lie to his whole, Scranton Joe, oh, my pop says, sitting around the kitchen table. It puts the total lie to all of that fake empathy that he exudes all the time, because he clearly couldn't care less. He just wants people to stop complaining and to understand that this is okay, you have to pay more, but look at all the money we're giving to Ukraine. Don't you realize that it's all for a good cause?
Yeah, we had the most successful congressional term in the history of the republic. Why are you all disgruntled? This is annoying. Yeah.
He also has such a funny view of the passage of time. It was a month, that was a whole month ago. He said this once before about, I can't remember what it was, but come on, man, that was a month ago that I said he just has this weird, sort of object permanence, this is failure of object permanence. Yeah, no, I mean, I guess there are some people who find the whole come on, man thing appealing, and maybe this was an attempt to resuscitate that. But as Seth is pointing out, the utter tone deafness of it kind of thwarted any attempt at that they might have been making. I mean, on the Taiwan thing, Ryan, to your point about sort of rule by administration or shadow government or deep state or whatever, it's like I actually don't want I don't want I don't want declarations of war to be made by presidents sort of on a whim in a 60 Minutes interview, and I actually don't want the just random caprice of whoever happens to be in the Oval Office to be what like dictates our foreign policy. But there is, and there is in fact a committee, a bureau, you might say, a group, an organization of people who I would hope would, make those sorts of decisions after deliberation and with accountability of the people. And that group is called Congress. Like it's crazy to me that the people who are rushing in to like reassure us that Biden is not authoritative on Taiwan policy is like the White House. Like what kind of entity is the White House? That's not a thing. That's not, the White House is not a person, and this is not like School of Rock. So I'm not sure, like it's sort of not reassuring that it's like, oh, don't worry, the experts are taking care of it. Well, like what expert?
Yeah, we should give a nod to our system kind of still working a bit in the sense that the reassurance offered by the administration is more or less tracks with the longstanding Taiwan Relations Act. But no, you're right. I mean, this is it's partly an artifact of just how the presidency is. I mean, this is a debate that goes all the way back. We can finish on this dorky Claremont point. This goes all the way back to the very earliest debates over this president's status and foreign policy. So, George Washington wanted to declare neutrality in regards to the conflagration in France and the conflict between France and her enemies early in the Washington administration. Stay out of this. And so Madison and Hamilton have this long exchange under pseudonyms called the Pacificus Helvetius debates, where Hamilton basically says, look, the presidency is, he's our head diplomat. He kind of can create a state of affairs, especially in staying out of war, that sets the table for a Congress to deal with. And that's just the nature of the beast. And whereas Madison's argument was, by declaring neutrality as a matter of administration policy, Washington was stepping on the prerogatives of Congress in regards to making war or declaring war. So there's always been this kind of ambiguity about all this, and especially Cold War and after, or post World War II. The president has sort of loomed much larger than any other branch. I mean, the only competitor really would be Congress, but it's just our new state of affairs that the status quo in many ways of foreign policy and foreign diplomacy is set by the White House and the State Department, and Congress can revise it after the fact. So that's just where we are.
Well, the Roundtable is stepping in to rein in my unwieldy and wild statements. So I'm going to
out of time.
Shut the podcast down. Yes, what I'm trying to say is we're out of time. Yeah. The host has gone rogue, and now we're going to be shut down by perhaps the Roundtable personified is Jake, our producer. I don't know. In any case, that's all the time we have. As always, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to The Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at AmericanMind.org, Claremont.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate, and don't forget to rate, review positively, no negative reviews, please, 5 stars only, share and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really, really helps the show and helps grow our numbers when you let people know, either by word of mouth or on social media, or again with those 5-star reviews. If you have criticisms, keep them to yourself. Talk to you next week.